The concert was at its peak, the entire orchestra in silence waiting for André Rieu's bow movement, but he didn't raise his violin. Instead, he knelt down before a girl crying at the edge of the stage. She couldn't see the grandeur of the hall, nor the lights nor the gazes directed at her, but she could feel André Rieu's hand holding hers, and when he stopped everything to speak only to her, the entire theater discovered that this evening would never be forgotten. In Boston Symphony Hall, the air hung heavy with anticipation. 2,000 people sat in breathless silence as the world-famous violist raised his bow. It was the climax of his concert, the peak of the Blue Danube, when he suddenly stopped. In the front row sat a small girl, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes closed but not from concentration. They were always closed. Azalea Whitmore, 9 years old and born blind, had thought her whole life that music was only sound. Tonight she would discover it could be so much more. André's eyes found her in the crowd, and something in her posture, the way she leaned forward as if trying to catch the music with her whole body, made him lower his bow. "Wait," he whispered to his orchestra, so softly that only they could hear. 2,000 people held their breath. This wasn't planned. This wasn't in the program. This was the moment when everything would change. Azalea Whitmore had dreamed of music her whole life, but she had never known that dreams could become real. Next to her sat her father, Thatcher Whitmore, a man of few words, but with a heart full of love for his daughter. He had saved for months to buy tickets for André Rieu's concert, knowing how much music meant to Azalea. "Dad," she whispered, as the first violins began to play, "it sounds like angels singing." Thatcher smiled, his hand gently on her shoulder. "They are, sweetheart. They are." From the moment the concert began, Azalea was different from all other spectators. While others looked at the stage, at the elegant movements of André Rieu, at the beautiful costumes of the orchestra, Azalea listened with her entire being. Every note seemed to fall directly into her heart. Dashiell Crane, the sound engineer who had worked with André Rieu for 20 years, noticed the girl through his monitors. He was used to the behavior of concert-goers. Some came for the show, others for the music, but this girl was different. She moved with every melody as if she herself were part of the orchestra. "Look at that little girl in the front row," he whispered to his assistant. "She feels the music in a way I rarely see." It was during the second piece, a beautiful performance of Ave Maria, that Azalea began to change. The music seemed to call her, to pull her forward. She began to become restless in her seat, her hands moving as if conducting. "Dad," she whispered urgently, "I need to be closer to the music. Azalea, we're already in the front row." "No, Dad. I mean really close. I need to feel it, not just hear it." Thatcher looked at his daughter and saw something in her face he had rarely seen, pure, untamed desire. Since her birth, Azalea had learned that the world was full of things she couldn't see, places she couldn't go, experiences that were unreachable for her. But music had always been her refuge. As André Rieu played the delicate passages of Ave Maria, Azalea slowly began to stand up. It wasn't a conscious decision, more an instinctive response to the beauty surrounding her. "Where are you going, sweetheart?" Thatcher asked softly. "I don't know," she whispered back, "but the music is calling me." A few rows behind them sat Temperance Monroe, Tempo to her students, a middle-aged music teacher who had been coming to André Rieu's concerts since her youth. She had noticed the little girl's behavior and felt her heart constrict with compassion. "That child feels music like I've rarely seen in 30 years of teaching," she thought to herself. But not everyone in the theater was so understanding. As Azalea became more restless, some people around her began to get irritated. "Can't that child sit still?" muttered an older man behind them. "Some people have no theater manners," his wife added, loud enough for Thatcher to hear. Thatcher felt his cheeks flush with shame and protective instinct. He wanted to defend his daughter, but also knew they were here to enjoy the music, not to make a scene. "Azalea," he whispered, "maybe after intermission we can—" But his daughter was no longer listening. Her entire attention was focused on the music flowing from the orchestra. It was as if she had gone into a trance, completely absorbed in the world of sound and emotion that André Rieu had created. On stage, André Rieu noticed the unrest in the front row. As an experienced performer, he had learned to always be aware of his audience, and something about the movement in the front row caught his attention. He couldn't see the little girl clearly because of the stage lighting, but he sensed that something special was happening. "Continue with the second movement." He gestured subtly to his orchestra, his eyes still focused on the front row. Azalea now stood completely from her seat. Her father tried to gently pull her back, but she resisted without being aggressive. It was as if she were hypnotized by the music. "Dad, please," she whispered with an urgency he had never heard in her voice. "I need to be closer. I need to really feel it." The people around them now began to openly complain. Some spectators shook their heads with disapproval. A woman in an elegant evening dress turned around and said with barely concealed irritation, "Can't you control that child? We're here for culture, not a children's show." Those words hit Thatcher like a slap in the face. He had worked so hard to give his daughter this experience, and now he was being criticized for it. But when he looked at Azalea, he saw the tears in her closed eyes, and he realized this wasn't a whim. This was pure, unfiltered desire for something that had always seemed out of reach for her. Dashiell Crane watched from his sound booth and felt his heart constrict. He had a daughter the same age, and he could imagine how painful it must be for the father to see his child longing for something just beyond her reach. He grabbed his microphone and whispered to his team, "Keep an eye on the little girl in the front row. I think something beautiful is about to happen." Meanwhile, on stage, André Rieu began playing the final part of Ave Maria, but his attention was divided. There was something about the energy in the front row that wouldn't let him go. He had given thousands of concerts and had learned to recognize subtle changes in his audience's atmosphere, and tonight felt different. When the last notes of Ave Maria faded and the audience began to applaud, André used the moment of transition to get a better look at the front row. And that was the moment he saw her. A small girl, no older than 9 or 10, stood at the edge of her row, her small hands stretched toward the stage as if trying to touch the music. Her eyes were closed, but not from concentration. There was something different about her face, something André immediately recognized as the pure desire of someone who wanted to experience beauty but was limited by circumstances beyond her control. And then he realized it. She was blind. The realization hit him like lightning. This little girl had probably never seen the grandeur of a concert hall, had never been able to witness the elegant movements of an orchestra, had never been able to experience the visual magic that formed such an important part of his performances. But she was here, and she longed for the music with an intensity that touched his heart. In that moment, André Rieu made a decision that would define his career. He put down his violin, raised his hand to the orchestra, a gesture they all recognized as stop, and began walking toward the edge of the stage. The theater fell silent. 2,000 people held their breath. This wasn't planned. This wasn't in the program. André Rieu, the master of planned surprises, was about to do something completely spontaneous. The applause slowly died when the audience realized something unusual was happening. André Rieu had put down his violin and walked to the edge of the stage, his gaze directed at the front row where the little girl stood. Azalea felt the sudden silence around her and stopped her forward movement. She didn't know what was happening, but the atmosphere in the theater had changed. There was a tension in the air she couldn't place. "Dad," she whispered anxiously, "why did the music stop?" Thatcher looked at the stage and saw André Rieu standing there, looking in their direction. His heart began beating faster. "I don't know, sweetheart. Maybe there's a break." But the break continued, and the silence became uncomfortable. People began to whisper, wondering what was going on. Some began to get irritated. "What is this?" muttered the elegant woman behind them. "We didn't pay to listen to silence." Her husband nodded in agreement. If he's having technical problems, they could at least announce it. Azalea heard the whispers around her and felt a wave of shame wash over her. She began to understand that her behavior might be the cause of what was happening. Slowly, she sat back down, her head bowed. "I'm sorry, Dad," she whispered. "I think I did something wrong." Thatcher put his arm around his daughter. "No, sweetheart, you didn't do anything wrong. You just love music." But the looks from the people around them told a different story. Some looked with pity, others with irritation, and still others with the kind of uncomfortable gaze people get when confronted with something they don't understand. 3 rows behind them sat a middle-aged man who kept looking at Azalea more frequently. "Why do people bring children with disabilities to this kind of event?" he whispered to his wife. "It's disruptive to the rest of us." His wife nodded. "I understand they can love music too, but there are special performances for these kinds of situations." Temperance Monroe, who could hear the conversation behind her, turned around. "Excuse me," she said with a calm but firm voice, "but music is for everyone. This child has as much right to be here as anyone else." "Of course," the man answered defensively, "but she should consider other audience members." "She's not hurting anyone," Tempo insisted. "She's just listening with her whole heart." The discussion was noticed by other people nearby, and slowly the theatre began to divide into two camps. Those who felt Azalea had the right to enjoy music as she wanted, and those who felt her behavior was disruptive to others. On stage, André Rieu still stood at the edge, listening to the soft whispers rippling through the hall. He couldn't hear all the words, but he felt the tension building. And at the center of that tension sat a little girl who now clearly felt uncomfortable. Dashiell Crane watched from his sound booth and felt frustration rising. He had experienced these kinds of situations before, moments when the audience felt uncomfortable about something they didn't understand. He grabbed his headset and connected with André. "André, there's some unrest developing in the audience. Maybe we should just continue with the program." But André shook his head, a movement so subtle that only his technical team could see it. He wasn't planning to continue as if nothing had happened. Meanwhile, Azalea began to realize more and more that she was the cause of the disruption. The whispers around her grew louder, and although she couldn't always understand the specific words, she felt the mood of the people around her. "Dad," she whispered with a trembling voice, "I think we should leave." "No, Azalea, we're not here for them. We're here for the music. But they're angry at me. Not all people, sweetheart." Indeed, while some parts of the audience were getting irritated, others were beginning to understand what was happening. An elderly woman in the second row turned to the people behind her. "Be quiet," she said with an authority born from years of experience as a school principal. "That child has as much right to be here as all of us, maybe more, because she hears music in a way we never will." Her words had a calming effect on her immediate surroundings, but the discomfort remained palpable in other parts of the theatre. André Rieu looked at the little girl and saw how she shrank under the weight of attention. This wasn't what he had wanted. He hadn't intended to make her uncomfortable, but he realized his silence had exactly that effect. He made a decision. Instead of returning to his violin, he began slowly walking toward the edge of the stage where a set of stairs led to the hall. It was a movement he rarely made during his concerts. Normally he stayed on stage, but tonight felt different. The audience watched with growing curiosity and confusion as André began descending the stairs. Some thought it might be part of the show, a planned surprise, but others understood this was spontaneous. Azalea heard the sound of footsteps coming closer, but didn't dare look up. She had been so excited about this concert, and now she had made a mess of it. But then she heard a soft voice close to her say, "Excuse me, may I come through?" It was André Rieu himself standing next to her row. The people around her suddenly became very quiet. The man who had complained a few minutes ago about her presence now sat with his mouth open, staring at the world-famous violinist who had come to a small blind girl. "What's your name?" André asked Azalea softly. She looked up, or rather she turned her face in the direction of his voice. "Azalea," she whispered. "That's a beautiful name. And tell me, Azalea, do you love music?" For the first time since the silence had begun, Azalea smiled. "Yes, sir. More than anything." "I thought so. And you know what? I think you hear music in a way that's very special." The people in the front rows now listened breathlessly. The irritation and discomfort from a few minutes ago had been replaced by curiosity and, for some, a beginning understanding of what was happening. "Azalea," André continued, "would you do something for me?" She nodded enthusiastically. "Would you come with me to the stage?" The theatre collectively held its breath. This was unheard of. André Rieu was inviting an audience member onto the stage during a concert. Thatcher felt his heart in his throat. "Mr. Rieu, are you sure?" "Very sure," André answered with a smile. "Your daughter has something many people lose as they get older. She listens with her heart." He extended his hand to Azalea. "Come, we're going to make music together." With trembling hands, Azalea took his hand. For the first time in her life, she wouldn't just listen to music, she would be part of it. But just as she stood up to go with André, a sharp voice rang out from the back of the theatre. "This is outrageous. We paid for a professional performance, not a charity case." The words cut through the hall like a knife. Azalea stiffened. Her face turned red with shame. "Dad," she whispered, "maybe we really should leave." But André Rieu turned to the theatre, his face serious. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said with a voice that carried through the entire hall, "music is not a privilege for the fortunate. It is a gift for everyone who has a heart to feel." He looked specifically in the direction where the critical voice had come from. "And tonight we're all going to learn what music truly means." The tension in Boston Symphony Hall was palpable. André Rieu stood next to Azalea, his hand still extended to her, while the audience seemed divided between admiration and confusion about what was happening. Temperance Monroe couldn't watch the situation any longer. She stood up from her seat and began walking forward through the aisle. Eyes turned to her as she approached. "Azalea," she said softly when she reached them. "My name is Tempo. I'm a music teacher, and I want you to know you belong here. Music is for everyone, and especially for people like you who truly understand it." She addressed the people in the vicinity. "I've taught children music for 30 years, and I've rarely seen someone who listens to music as purely as this girl. We should be grateful to witness this moment." Her words had a calming effect on the immediate surroundings. Some people nodded in agreement, others looked ashamed at the ground. André smiled gratefully at Tempo. "Thank you, and you're right. This is a moment to be grateful for." He crouched down so he was at eye level with Azalea. "Listen, my little girl, there are people in this theater who think music is only for certain people, but we know better, don't we?" Azalea nodded, her confidence slowly returning. "Music is for everyone who has a heart," André continued. "And you, Azalea, you have the biggest heart of all." From his sound booth, Dashiell Crane watched with growing emotion. He had experienced many special moments in all his years with André Rieu, but this felt different. This felt like something much more important than entertainment. He grabbed his microphone and spoke to his team. "Make sure all cameras are focused on this. This is becoming history." Meanwhile, on stage, the Johann Strauss Orchestra waited patiently. Some musicians smiled at what was happening. Others looked concerned about the interruption of their professional routine. But the first violinist, Octavia Sterling, a middle-aged woman who had played with André for 20 years, understood what was happening. She put down her violin and began clapping softly. One by one, her colleagues followed her example until the entire orchestra was applauding for the little girl who still stood nervously next to their conductor. The orchestra's applause gave other members of the audience the courage to show their support. First a few people in the front rows, then more and more until a large part of the theater was applauding. "Look, Azalea," André said. "Do you hear that? That's the sound of people who understand that music is for everyone." But not everyone was convinced. From the side of the theater came a man in an expensive suit forward, Garrison Kemp, the theater manager responsible for the evening's proceedings. "Mr. Rieu," he said in a hushed tone when he reached them, "we have a schedule." The audience expects music," André interrupted him, "and that's exactly what they're going to get. Better music than they've ever heard before." The manager looked uncomfortable. "But the insurance, if something happens with the child on stage—" "Nothing will happen to her except magic," André said decisively. "And if you're worried about insurance, contact my manager. I take full responsibility." Thatcher, who had been watching from his seat, now also stood up. "Mr. Rieu, I don't know how to thank you." "By letting your daughter be who she is," André answered. "By teaching her that her differences make her strong, not weak." He held Azalea's hand tighter. "Come, let's go to the stage." Together they began climbing the stairs. Azalea walked carefully, her hand in André's as he guided her. With each step, she felt less like an outsider and more like someone who belonged. "How does the stage feel under your feet?" André asked as they reached the top. "Big," Azalea whispered in awe. "And warm as if there's love in the wood." André smiled. "That's exactly what I feel too. This stage has heard thousands of hours of music, thousands of moments of joy. All that emotion is stored in the wood." He led her to the center of the stage where his violin still stood on its stand. "Azalea," André said, "I want to let you feel something. May I have your hands?" She extended her small hands. André took them carefully and placed them on the side of his violin. "Do you feel that?" he asked. Azalea's eyes widened with amazement. "It vibrates even without being played." "It does. That's because music never really stops," André explained. "A violin that has heard a lot of music continues to remember that music in the fibers of the wood, in the tension of the strings." He lifted the violin and placed it under his chin. "Now I'm going to play, and I want you to put your hands on my arm so you can feel how music is born." Azalea did as he asked, her small hands resting on his left arm. Then André began to play. Not "The Blue Danube" as planned, but something much simpler and more beautiful, "Somewhere Over the Rainbow." It was a song about dreams coming true, about finding a place where you belong. And as he played, Azalea felt not only the vibrations of the strings, but also the movement of his fingers, the emotion in his arm, the way his entire body was part of the music. "I feel it," she whispered in awe. "I feel how the music is made." The audience watched in breathless silence. Even those who had been critical earlier couldn't deny that something magical was happening on stage. Temperance Monroe still stood in the aisle, tears streaming down her cheeks. "This is why I became a music teacher," she whispered to herself. Dashiell Crane watched from his booth and felt his heart constrict. He had built his entire career around creating perfect audio experiences. But this went beyond all his technical knowledge. This was pure human connection through music. When André finished the song, the theater was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Azalea still stood with her hands on his arm, an expression of pure joy on her face. "Thank you," she whispered. "That was the most beautiful thing I've ever felt," André smiled. "But we're not done yet. Now you're going to play a piece." Azalea's eyes widened with fear. "But I can't." "Of course you can. Music isn't about technique, Azalea. It's about heart, and you have more heart than most people I know." He placed his violin in her hands, helping her small fingers to hold it. "It doesn't matter how it sounds. It only matters that it comes from you." With André's hands guiding hers, Azalea drew the bow across the strings. The sound that came out wasn't perfect. It was sharp and unpolished, but it was real. It came directly from her heart, and in that moment, everyone in the theater understood what André Rieu had meant. This was music in its purest form, not technical perfection, but emotional truth. The applause that followed was different from any applause the theater had ever heard. It wasn't just appreciation for a performance. It was recognition of something much deeper. It was thousands of people collectively acknowledging that beauty doesn't depend on perfection, but on authenticity. Thatcher sat in the front row with tears streaming down his face. He had always tried to protect his daughter from a world that saw her as different, but tonight he had seen that world embrace her. "Dad!" Azalea called from the stage, her voice full of joy. "Can you hear me? I'm making music." "I hear you, sweetheart," he called back. "You're beautiful." André carefully took his violin back from Azalea and placed his hand on her shoulder. "And now? How about a duet? You and me together?" "Really?" Her voice was full of disbelief. "Really? I'll play and you'll sing. What song would you like to sing?" Azalea thought. "Do you know Amazing Grace? My mum always sang that to me before she left." André's heart broke a little. He hadn't known that Azalea had also lost her mother. "Of course I know that song. And I think your mum is with us tonight, listening to your beautiful voice." He began playing the delicate opening of Amazing Grace. Azalea waited until she felt the right moment, and then she began to sing with a voice that was clear and pure as crystal. "Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see." Her voice carried through the entire theater, and the effect was electric. This wasn't a professional singer. This was a child singing from her soul, each word drenched with personal meaning. "I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see." At that last line, "was blind, but now I see," everyone in the theater understood the deep irony and truth of what was happening. Azalea might be physically blind, but she saw things most of them would never see. When the song ended, the theater remained silent for a long time. It was as if no one wanted to break this perfect moment by applauding. Finally, it was André himself who broke the silence. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his arm still around Azalea's shoulder, "tonight we experienced something rare in this world. We heard real music, not just notes and rhythms, but the music of the human heart." André looked out over the audience, his arm still protectively around Azalea's shoulder. The theater was filled with an energy he had rarely felt in his 30 years as a performer. A mixture of emotion, wonder, and a deep awareness that they were witnessing something special. "Azalea," he said softly, "do you want to say something to all these people?" She turned her face to the audience, even though she couldn't see them. "Thank you," she said with a voice that carried through the entire theater. "Thank you for listening to my music, even though it wasn't perfect." "It was perfect!" someone shouted from the audience. "It was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard," André smiled. "You know what, Azalea? I think these people want to hear more music. How about we play one last song together?" "What song?" "Let me choose. Something that fits this special evening." André gestured to his orchestra, which had been waiting patiently all this time. "Ladies and gentlemen of the Johann Strauss Orchestra, may we play The Blue Danube together, but this time differently than ever before." The orchestra members smiled and picked up their instruments. This was the piece they had started with before everything changed, but now it felt like a completely new beginning. "Azalea," André said, "I want you to place your hand on my violin while I play. Not to play along, but to feel how the music flows through the instrument. And if you feel like singing or moving, do it. This is your moment." He counted off to the orchestra. 1, 2, 3. The opening notes of The Blue Danube filled the theatre. But this time it was different. André played with an emotional intensity he had rarely shown, inspired by the little girl next to him who could feel every note through her hand on his violin. Azalea began humming softly along, and then, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, she began moving to the music, not choreographed or calculated, but as a pure expression of joy. From his sound booth, Dashiell Crane filmed everything. He knew this moment had to be preserved forever. "This is going around the world," he whispered to his assistant. "This is the kind of moment people will talk about until the day they die." In the audience, reactions were varied, but all intense. Temperance Monroe still stood in the aisle, her face wet with tears. Around her she saw people openly crying, others smiling with pure joy, and still others clearly struggling with emotions they hadn't expected to feel. The man who had complained earlier about Azalea's presence now sat hunched over in his seat, his head in his hands. His wife gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "John," she whispered, "I think we learned something tonight." He looked up, his eyes moist. "I'm ashamed," he said. "That little girl understands music better than I ever will." In the second row sat an elderly woman who had been going to concerts since her youth. She had seen thousands of performances by the greatest maestros of her time. But this was different. 50 years I've been going to concerts," she whispered to her neighbor, "and tonight I'm hearing real music for the first time." The orchestra continued playing, the waltz building to its familiar climax, but André kept his tempo adjusted to Azalea's movements. He let himself be guided by her natural sense of rhythm and melody, instead of the other way around. And then, at the peak of the piece, something incredible happened. Azalea spontaneously began singing the melody along. Not words, because The Blue Danube is instrumental, but a melodious la-la-la that fit perfectly with the music. The orchestra followed her lead. Some players added their own voices to her song. It wasn't planned harmony, but something that arose from the moment itself. Thatcher sat in the front row and could hardly believe what he was seeing. His daughter, whom he had always tried to protect from a world that didn't understand her, now stood on the stage of one of America's most prestigious theaters, leading a world-famous orchestra in an improvisation. "Harmony," he whispered upward, speaking to his deceased wife. "Can you see this? Our little girl is making music with André Rieu." As the waltz approached its natural end, André made a gesture to the orchestra to slow down. He wanted to make this moment last as long as possible, because he knew that both Azalea and the audience would never forget this. In the final measure, he leaned toward Azalea. "Do you want to play the very last note together with me?" She nodded enthusiastically. André placed his hands over hers on the violin, and together they drew the bow across the string for the last long, beautiful note of The Blue Danube. The note hung in the air of the theatre, pure and perfect, before slowly fading into silence. For a moment no one moved. It was as if the entire theatre was holding its breath, afraid to break the magic. Then the applause began. It wasn't the polite clapping usual at the end of a classical piece. This was something else. An explosion of emotion that rippled through the entire theatre. People jumped to their feet, some cheering, others crying openly. "Bravo!" someone shouted. "Bravo! Encore!" More voices joined in. "Bravo! Encore!" André raised his hand to quiet the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen, I think we all experienced what real music is. Not the notes on a page, not technical perfection, but the music that arises when heart and soul come together." He looked at Azalea, who was beaming with joy. "And this young lady has taught us all that music is not something you see or learn. It's something you feel." Azalea took the microphone André handed her. Her voice, amplified by the sound system, rang clear through the theatre. "Thank you all. You made me feel like I belong. And now I know that music isn't about being perfect. It's about loving." The applause became even louder, but now something else mixed in. The sound of people shouting, "We love you, Azalea. You belong here. Thank you." Dashiell Crane looked at his cameras and knew he had gold in his hands. This performance would go viral, would inspire people around the world, but more importantly, it would change Azalea's life forever. And indeed, as the applause continued, Azalea felt something she had never felt before, the absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. The applause seemed to last forever. André stood next to Azalea on stage and felt how the audience's energy washed over them, like a warm wave of love and acceptance. He had given thousands of concerts, but this was different. This was transformation. "Azalea," he whispered as the applause slowly subsided, "how do you feel?" "Like I'm flying," she whispered back, her face radiant with joy. "Like I'm not just hearing the music, but part of it." André smiled. "You are. You've always been part of the music. Tonight we just showed it to everyone." As the audience slowly sat down, André took the microphone again. "Ladies and gentlemen, before we end this special evening, I want to tell you something." The theater became quiet. Everyone focused on his words. "When I saw Azalea sitting in the front row tonight, I saw something that touched my heart. I saw a child listening to music in a way I rarely see in adults, without distraction, without judgment, without expectations. Just pure, undiluted enjoyment." He looked at Azalea. "And that made me realize we can all learn something from this special girl." From the audience came agreeing murmurs. "Music," André continued, "is not something you learn. It's something you feel. It's not something you see, it's something you experience with your entire being. And Azalea has shown us all what that looks like." He gestured to the orchestra. "My musicians and I have studied for years to be able to play technically perfect. But Azalea has shown us tonight what emotionally perfect sounds like." The audience applauded spontaneously, but André raised his hand. "I'm not done yet." He crouched down so he was at eye level with Azalea. "Little girl, you gave me a gift tonight that I'll never forget. You reminded me why I started making music." "Why?" Azalea asked curiously. "Not to become famous, not to impress people with technical skills, but to touch hearts, to make people feel what you made them feel tonight. Pure, undiluted joy." He stood up and addressed the audience again. "And that's why I want to announce something." Dashiell Crane leaned forward in his booth. This wasn't planned, and he wondered what André was up to. "Starting next month," André announced, "the Johann Strauss Orchestra will give special monthly concerts for children and adults with visual impairments. We're calling it Music for the Heart. Concerts where the emphasis is on feeling and experiencing rather than seeing and performing." The audience burst into applause, but André wasn't finished yet. "And Azalea," he said, turning to her again, "I want to ask if you'll be our first guest of honor at that concert. Will you perform together with us?" Azalea's mouth fell open in amazement. "Really? May I do that?" "Not only may you, I insist on it." Thatcher jumped up from his seat in the audience. "Mr. Rieu, I don't know how to thank you." "By continuing to support your daughter in her love for music," André answered, "and by letting her know she's special, not despite her blindness, but because of the unique way she experiences the world." Temperance Monroe came forward from the aisle. "Mr. Rieu, may I say something?" André nodded and gave her the microphone. "My name is Temperance Monroe, and I'm a music teacher," she said to the audience. "I've taught children music for 30 years, and tonight I saw something I rarely experience. A child who understands music in her soul." She looked at Azalea. "Dear girl, you taught us all something tonight. You showed us that music isn't a privilege for the talented or the trained. It's a gift for everyone who has a heart to feel." She addressed the audience again. "And I want to challenge everyone here tonight. Go home and listen to music like Azalea does. Not with your eyes, not with your expectations, but with your heart." The applause that followed was heartfelt and prolonged. André took the microphone back. "There's one more thing I want to do before we say goodbye." He walked to his violin case and took out a second instrument, a smaller, simpler violin he used for special occasions. "Azalea," he said, as he handed the violin to her, "this is for you. It's not the most expensive violin in the world, but it's an instrument that has known much love. I want you to keep it so you can practice at home for our concert next month." Azalea took the violin with trembling hands. "For me? Really? Really? And Tempo, would you help Azalea with lessons? I'll cover all costs, of course." Tempo's eyes filled with tears. "It would be an honor." The theater exploded again in applause, but this time, everyone present stood up. It wasn't just applause for a great performance. It was applause for humanity, for inclusion, for the power of music to change hearts. Azalea stood in the center of the stage, the violin in her arms, surrounded by the orchestra and by the warmth of 2,000 people who had come to know and love her in the course of one evening. "Mr. André," she said, her voice amplified by the microphone, "may I say one more thing?" "Of course," She turned to the audience, her face radiant. "You made me feel tonight that being blind doesn't mean you're less. It just means you look at the world differently. And sometimes because of that, you see things others miss." She paused. "I see music in colors you can't see. I feel emotions in melodies you might not hear. And tonight you let me share what I see and feel." Her voice became softer, but still carried through the entire theater. "Thank you for making me feel I'm not alone. That there are people who understand that being different doesn't mean being wrong." And then, spontaneously and unexpectedly, she began singing softly, "Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound." One by one, others joined her. First André, then the orchestra, then Tempo, then Thatcher from the audience, and finally the entire theater. 2,000 voices united in one song, one moment of perfect harmony. It was the most moving end to a concert that Boston Symphony Hall had ever experienced. When the song ended, there was a moment of perfect silence, and then, as if conducted by one person, everyone in the theater began singing, "For she's a jolly good fellow, for she's a jolly good fellow, for she's a jolly good fellow, and so say all of us." Azalea laughed through her tears, overwhelmed by the love washing over her. Months later, people would still talk about that evening. Videos of Azalea's performance would be viewed millions of times on social media. But for her, the most important thing wasn't the fame or attention. The most important thing was that she had learned that evening that she belonged in the world, that her way of experiencing wasn't less but different, and that different could be beautiful. André Rieu had given his most famous concert that evening, not because of the technical perfection of his playing, but because of the human perfection of his heart. And Azalea had learned that music isn't something you see. It's something you feel, something you are, something you share with others. The most beautiful music, André had told the audience as a farewell, is that of the heart, and that night, 2,000 hearts made music together. The special Music for the Heart concert series became one of the most celebrated programs in Boston Symphony Hall's history. Every month, children and adults with visual impairments were invited not just to listen, but to participate, to feel, to become part of the music. And at every concert, André would tell Azalea's story, not to make her famous, but to remind everyone that music is a universal language that transcends all barriers. Azalea continued her violin lessons with Tempo, who became not just her teacher, but her mentor and friend. Together they explored music in ways that went beyond traditional methods, focusing on feeling and emotional expression rather than just technical precision. Thatcher watched his daughter blossom in ways he had never imagined possible. The shy girl who once felt like she didn't belong anywhere had become a confident young musician who inspired thousands. "Your mother would be so proud," he told her one evening after a practice session. "I know, Dad," Azalea said, smiling. "Sometimes when I play, I feel like she's right there with me, listening." Dashiell Crane's video of that magical night was viewed over 30 million times worldwide. It was featured on news programs, talk shows, and shared by celebrities and everyday people alike. But more importantly, it started conversations about accessibility, inclusion, and the power of music to bring people together. Schools across America began using the video in their music programs, teaching students that talent comes in many forms, and that sometimes the most beautiful performances come from the most unexpected places. The man who had complained that night, John, became one of the program's biggest supporters. He wrote a public letter of apology that went viral, admitting his prejudice and thanking Azalea for teaching him to see beyond his narrow perspective. "I thought I knew what music was," he wrote, "but a 9-year-old blind girl showed me I had been deaf to its true meaning all along." Boston Symphony Hall created the Azalea Whitmore Accessibility Fund, ensuring that every performance would be accessible to people with disabilities. They installed special audio description systems, tactile programs, and reserved sections where children like Azalea could fully experience concerts. But perhaps the most beautiful legacy was the simplest one. At the end of every concert in Symphony Hall, there's now a moment of silence, a moment where the audience is invited to close their eyes and simply feel the music, the way Azalea taught them to. André Rieu still plays Somewhere Over the Rainbow at every concert, and when he does, he always dedicates it to a little girl who taught me that the most beautiful music is the music we feel with our hearts. And Azalea, she's still making music, still inspiring people, still proving that what makes us different is often what makes us extraordinary. Because that night in Boston Symphony Hall, 2,000 people learned a lesson they would never forget. Music isn't something you see. It's something you feel. It's something you are. And when you open your heart to it, it can change everything. The most beautiful music, André said that night, comes not from perfect technique but from perfect hearts. And Azalea Whitmore showed us all what that sounds like.